Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the latest edition of the Jake's Take with Jacob Elyachar Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Elyachar, the chief content producer and writer of jakestake.com, a pop culture entertainment news website. If you're listening to this on our audio platforms, please download this episode and let's download more episodes as well. And also, please give us a 5-star rating. I am so honored and privileged to be welcoming this comedian here today. His work has received 5-star ratings from The Guardian, The Independent, and the Daily Telegraph. He has sold out runs on London's West End and toured internationally with Australia, Europe, India, and appeared in US Netflix as a Joke Comedy Festival. Speaking of Netflix, on September 10th, 2024, he will be making his debut. So please help me welcome Ahir Shah to the podcast.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for having me.
It is a privilege having you here. Yeah. It means a lot. You are amazing. I love your quick fire speed and delivery.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And so I should say before we begin, I was particularly taken with the fact that before we began this record, you gave a proper 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And it really made me feel like I think this is probably the closest to being an astronaut I've ever felt in my life. And so it's very exciting.
Thank you so much, Ahir. It really means a lot. So let's get started, shall we? When did you get interested in performing, and how did that passion evolve and desire to pursue a career in comedy?
So, as I mentioned in the show, a lot of it began for me with just the awareness that it's a thing that one could do, and particularly, well, obviously, listeners who won't be able to see this, but I'm a British Indian man. And so come from that background. And when I was growing up, I was born in 1990, growing up in London in the 90s, noughties. And while it was very much the case that I grew up in the most, which is still the most ethnically diverse part of London, so the borough of Brent. And so when I was wandering around, I was very aware that everyone's from everywhere and in pretty equal numbers, that's pretty normal. And yet when you watch television, for instance, you're like, oh no, okay, so now I'm conscious when people talk about quote unquote minority, this is what it means because you're never on that. And then in 1998, which is the sort of point that I start ends the Netflix special, a show started airing on the BBC called Goodness Gracious Me, which I don't know sort of how popular this became in the United States, but I know that sort of certain sketches from it certainly became popular all over the world. And this was, as far as I was aware at the time, and I'm aware at the time, like a thing that had a central cast of 4 British Asian performers who were just doing this like incredible comedy and like something that the entire country, it felt, like back when people had like linear TV and the water cooler moments and all of this sort of thing, like that was the show, right? And like the driving force of the show were these 4 British Asian people. And also, by the way, for American listeners, I will be using Asian in the UK tends to mean South Asian. I know that in the United States tends to mean East Asian, but so it's a bit different the way that we speak about it here. But so really, it was the realization that such a thing was even like possible in the first place, and that it didn't just need to be the whole sort of doctor, engineer, like all these sorts of things, which are very, like, this is not to denigrate those extraordinarily important, extraordinarily, at least comparatively lucrative professions. But yeah, just the realization that, okay, you like sort of acting in school plays and you like doing that sort of thing, but hold on, these are guys who are like prime time TV that the whole country is talking about, that you could do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you've done amazing work. So I would love to learn about your show creation process. So how long does it take you to create a show from inception to its final curtain call?
So a lot of the way that comedy, particularly in the UK, tends to work, and I know that this is extraordinarily different to the way that comedy in most other parts of the world work, are because we have, and as I speak to you, I am in the city of Edinburgh in Scotland during the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and because this sort of becomes every August the sort of centerpiece of a comedian's universe, right? So it's the most normal thing in the world for British comedians is that you sort of spend August here doing one show, then you start writing the next one in September, and the following August you are up doing that again. So generally speaking, for lots of our careers, like an 11-month functionally turnaround is the normal thing for a new show to be made. And I know that sort of in the early stages of this show, I sort of initially so I started doing it in August 2023 for the first time, but the inception of it came around October, November 2022. So relatively by the standards of I think comparative to lots of American comedians, a sort of shorter time frame to work up an additional hour. But yeah, that's where it sort of sprung up, where I was at the time thinking about the fact that the following year, so as of 2023, I was going to get married, and now I'm married. And so lots of it sort of sprung from thinking about, well, what's the longest marriage that I know in my family? You know, you always go to your family for comparators when you're doing these big life things. And for me, that was my mum's parents, right, who were married for just under a half century until my grandfather's passing. And so was thinking a lot about them and about him, and trying to learn more about their younger life, and how it actually was for them when they were about my age. And also, very shortly thereafter, we ended up in a situation where there, for a couple of years, ended up being a British Indian Prime Minister of the UK. And just thinking about the sheer gulf between the country that he arrived in, my grandfather, in 1964, when he was by that stage sort of in his early 30s, but had been married for just under a decade, had 3 children, and everything, and the hostility, and that, like, just, you know, like it was in the 60s, like it's not particularly surprising to anyone listening how that was, and thinking about sort of what those 6 decades were. So it's sort of the production process of the show ended up being this sort of 10 months thinking about 60 years, really.
That's amazing. That's amazing how much progress has been made. And not only that, a half a century. That's amazing.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that it genuinely is stunning. And I think that so much as I talk about in the show, of because my grandfather passed away in 2002, and there's just elements of, I think, the contemporary United Kingdom that, even having passed away in the 21st century, like the early 21st century, like that, I sincerely don't think that he would believe. But if I were able to get in my time machine and tell him how things were going to shake out. And this is, of course, not to say that political representation is the be all and end all, or anything like that, or that all problems are solved and everything's perfect. That's obviously not what this thing means. But certainly it felt very sort of grounding when I spent a long time sort of interviewing my mother about her youth, in order to try and learn more about this story of her parents' 30s, basically, and the sheer gulf between the country that she grew up in, and we went to exactly the same school, the school that she went to versus the school that I went to, right, those decades apart, was utterly staggering.
Wow, wow, wow. All righty. So you're coming from Edinburgh, and especially the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And your previous shows, 2017's Control and 2018 Stepper, received critical praise and were nominated for Best in Show. When you do bring a show to the festival, does any of the previous praise play a role into creating your production? Why or why not?
I think that, I mean, obviously, it helps to learn what works, right? And that's not necessarily a result of awards or whatever, but like you feel it in the room, right? You're like, okay, this is the sort of thing that works. And then you grow in through experience, are able to not necessarily produce more of the same, but try and drill down to, okay, I think that this is the stuff that I am interested in communicating, and this is the way in which it seems as though my communicating it functions. And functions well. So let's go more down that path, really. And of course, there's the additional thing of, once after a while you've done this for a few years and a few festivals, etc., then there's just like it's easier getting people through the door in the sort of simplest terms.
Absolutely, absolutely. So last 2023, your show Ends was a runaway hit that amassed lots of five-star reviews. So what were some of the factors, in your opinion, that the audience connected with Ends over some of your previous productions?
Well, I think that what when I was writing it and starting performing it, I naturally, because it's a family story and therefore a particular story, right, and an individual story, uh, my hope with it was that, okay, hopefully this is I'm getting my family story out there, and hopefully there are elements of this that people will engage with, and perhaps if you are from a narrowly similar background to me, then you will identify with it even more, right? But then the lovely thing, which I, in retrospect wasn't surprised by, but it's always going to sound strange to you because you're talking about a very particular experience with particular people who you know and you are related to, was the fact that it seemed to resonate with a much broader sort of section of people than I necessarily thought that it would initially. And this is not only people from a very vast array of sort of who had family from immigrant or refugee backgrounds, but also just the fact that it was trying to be a show about Britain and the way that Britain is now, and the way that I see Britain now, and therefore, at the time, particularly performing it in the UK, that was the thing that, of course, could resonate a bit more broadly. And I'd not necessarily considered that when I was making it, but I was very glad to see it happen and be possible.
And it was amazing. I watched the special already, and but thanks to preview. Your delivery is unbelievably amazing. Your quick fire, especially your monologues were so quick. And like whereas like the long form of speak, what I love is like you were going da 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 da. You're hitting A through E, A through Z, and I was following every single point.
Oh well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's just you're like, well, I've got a lot to get in over the next hour, so let's go for it.
Alrighty, so in addition to receiving all the theatrical reviews and everything from the UK press, you also received Netflix approached you and your team about bringing Ends to the platform. So, what was your reaction when Netflix said we want our audience to see Ends?
Oh, I was gutted, mate. It's awful. No, of course, no, of course, it's like absolutely wonderful. And I think that it's almost in the same way that to Google has become a verb as a result of this. That like there is such thing like the world of stand-up. There is this thing which is the Netflix special, right? And it's like capital T, capital N, capital S. And so to be able to have one of those and do that is a really extraordinary privilege, right? That they've been sort of so good at the sort of quantity of this particular art form that they've been able to sort of put out and expand to a wider audience over the last few years has been really phenomenal. I don't think that necessarily, there was the days of DVDs and the days of all of that, but it's sort of a step change for the way that the accessibility of stand-up has changed to a wider audience. Like simultaneously the best and the most frustrating thing about a form like stand-up, because there isn't a fourth wall, you're in it together, you're all in this room, but the best thing is that we're in this room together, and everything that occurs between us is then left after the end of this evening. But similarly, when and I hope that people enjoy it and people like it, and if you feel like, oh, you've made something good, and you're like, but only like I will only ever be able to do it to the people who are right in front of me at any given time. Right, so the idea that could therefore receive a wider audience than just those who I happen to be in front of in Edinburgh, in London, or wherever, is a wonderful thing.
And while we're on the subject of stand-up, are there different different jokes hit differently? For example, if you're with your Edinburgh audience than your London audience, or maybe your Australian audience?
Um, so I think that one of the really interesting things about this, and so I've been lucky enough to tour in a whole bunch of countries, and probably the most significant one for me, sort of on emotional level, was when in 2017 I was able to do a tour of a bunch of different cities in India, and I'd never done anything over there before, but even as in I'd never done stand up, but I've obviously done things there before, like asking my aunt for things. But you realize that, and I don't think that it's necessarily there's a way of interpreting this in a pejorative sense, which is to do with like shrinkings of culture and whatnot. But I don't think it necessarily is that. It's the fact that you do stand-up comedy in a club in Mumbai or Bangalore or Hyderabad or Delhi or like any of these cities, and you're like, right, everyone here has through the example that I was giving back in 2017 is that oh, everyone's like watching YouTube and whatnot, so like not just through the television or the cinema or whatever, like there is accessibility to like this is international comedy, and you all watch heaps of American stand-up, heaps of British stand-up, heaps of, like all of these things from all around the world. So it's not necessarily like, of course, every culture and country will have its own idiom, and perhaps there are things that will hit differently in different places, of course. But through the internet, in large part, it's almost like that thing in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy where he puts a babble fish in his ear, and it's suddenly like everyone can communicate with everyone, right? And that's what has sort of been allowed to happen. So through something like YouTube, particularly, I think it's like comedy has a babble fish now.
Absolutely. And while we bring up the subject of YouTube, and that's the reason why I saw you on YouTube. I first discovered you and became a fan of you on YouTube because I loved your delivery. It's the same way I discover acts from Britain's Got Talent and Canada's Got Talent is through YouTube. And I think YouTube has been one of the best common denominators for people to go outside their bubble, no matter if it's a
Yeah.
US bubble or a UK bubble.
Absolutely, and like even the fact that I'm staying in Edinburgh with another comedian, Garrett Millerick, who's also fat, and you can watch on YouTube, and is a British comedian, but it's been on like went over to the US, was on Conan, whatever when that was still on, and very very funny man. But we were talking the other day, and he was just recommending to me something that two sort of greats of British comedy, one no longer with us, Chris Morris and Peter Cook, the late Peter Cook, did together. And I was like, oh, that's a bit like I've never even heard of this. I didn't even know that they'd done a thing together. And he's like, yeah, it's probably all on YouTube. And I looked at it, it's all on YouTube. And so I've not yet sort of listened to it. I'm saving it for a long walk, and that's what a wonderful thing to have this accessibility at your fingertips to decades of culture and culture from all around the world. Remarkable.
Absolutely. YouTube's an amazing place and like a perfect guy for classroom for that.
But for contractual reasons, not as good as Netflix.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we got to go talk about the special. So what are some, let's ask, so what are some of the lessons that that the audience should check out should walk away from after they watch Ends on Netflix?
Yeah, well, I think that I would hope that it's a very particular story, and it's a very particular story to me and my family, and particularly my grandparents, and particularly within that my late grandfather. But I think that there are also like heaps of universals within these stories about what it like about family and sacrifice and the nature of all of that. And I promise you that there are also lots of jokes in it. It's built out of jokes. I'm going to make it sound less funny than it is, I hope. But so I just I hope that that's what's taken away, really, because there are and maybe like hopefully if it could inspire people to have conversations within perhaps even their own families or friends' families and things like that, because there are heaps of people who never told a story or never told their story and never had their story told because A, there was no one to listen in the first place, and B, there was a huge attitude of head down, get on with it. If you show that it's getting to you, then like you gotta you put this wall up the entire time. Right. And that's the sort of people who ended up being the sort of originators of my life. And then you go like, oh, well, maybe now is the time 60 years on that this story can actually be told and there might be someone to listen.
Absolutely. So last question, are you ready for it, Ahir?
I'm never ready for anything. I'm extraordinarily. I'm always caught unaware. I'm always like wearing one shoe. So,
all,
um,
all right. So my last question is, where can my audience find you on social media to follow you on your journey?
yes. So I am now on Instagram, which I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a very new social media platform that I've decided recently to get involved with. So it's just Ahir Shah, my name on that, and I am very much no longer on Twitter because of you know like
I know. I
like
totally understand. I totally understand.
but yes, so it's Ahir Shah on Instagram, and then yes, the special will be out on Netflix on September the 10th.
Absolutely. And guys, if you want to listen to more episodes of the Jake's Take with Jacob Elyachar podcast, visit our channels on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, and YouTube. Jacob Elyachar, JACOBELYACHAR. Are you on social media? Because I'm on social media too. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, Threads, Jake's Take with Jacob Elyachar, JACOBELYACHAR. And if you want to find out my interview, see all my other interviews, visit jake-chick.com, jake-chick.com. Ahir, thank you so much for taking time in your schedule to talk with me today. You are an amazing guest, and everybody, please go see his special.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
All righty, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great everybody. Goodbye.